June 1944. A British officers' club in southern England. Cigarette smoke hangs thick in the air, Scotch glasses clink, and a group of British colonels are having what they think is a private conversation. Their voices carry across the room where American officers are trying to enjoy their drinks in peace. Then one of them says it, loud enough for everyone to hear. The problem with the Americans? They're Britain's inexperienced little brother playing soldier. They show up late, throw money at the problem, and act like they won the war single-handedly. The American lieutenant from Ohio freezes. His knuckles turn white around his glass. His sergeant grabs his arm before he can start a brawl and whispers something that changes everything. "Not here, sir. But make damn sure General Patton hears every word of what they just said." Because when word reached Patton that British officers were calling American soldiers inexperienced children playing dress-up, he didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He smiled. Then he unleashed a systematic, data-driven humiliation that would destroy British military arrogance forever. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from, what state, what city, or if you're watching from a base overseas. Because this story isn't just about Patton. It's about every American who's ever been underestimated and came back to prove the doubters dead wrong. Smash that like button if you're already fired up, and subscribe now because you won't believe what Patton did next. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace. The kind that comes before a storm. The American lieutenant from Ohio, his name was James Mitchell, a 24-year-old farm boy who'd never been further from home than Chicago before the war, felt the heat crawl up his neck. His fingers tightened around his glass so hard he thought it might shatter. His sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Kowalski from Detroit, saw it coming. He'd seen that look before, the look of a man about to do something stupid and noble in equal measure. The British colonel with the handlebar mustache laughed, encouraged by his companions and the expensive scotch warming his ego. "It's like watching a wealthy provincial try to join a gentleman's club," he continued, his voice carrying across the room with theatrical confidence. "They have the membership fee, but they'll never really belong." Another British officer chimed in, his posh accent dripping with condescension. "They've been in this war for what, 2 years? We've been fighting since 1939. They show up late to both world wars, throw money and bodies at the problem, and then act like they won it single-handedly. It's embarrassing, really." Lieutenant Mitchell started to rise from his chair. His knuckles were white. His jaw was clenched so tight his temples throbbed. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to cross that room, grab that mustached colonel by his perfectly pressed collar, and introduce him to some good old-fashioned American diplomacy delivered via fist. The British officers saw him move. They smiled. They wanted this. They wanted the ignorant American to make a scene, to prove their point about uncivilized colonials who couldn't control their emotions. It would be the perfect ending to their little performance. That's when Sergeant Kowalski's hand clamped down on Mitchell's arm like a vice. "Don't," Kowalski whispered, his voice low and dangerous. His grip was iron. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto his young lieutenants. "Don't give them what they want." Mitchell tried to pull away. "Let go, Sergeant. I'm going to—" "You're going to sit down, sir," Kowalski interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to finish your drink. You're going to smile. And then you're going to remember every single word they just said." Mitchell's face twisted with barely suppressed rage. "They called us children. They called us inexperienced. They said we don't belong here." Kowalski leaned in closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. His eyes never left the British officers. His expression was calm, but his words carried a cold fury that made Mitchell's blood run cold. "I know exactly what they said, sir, and I know exactly what you want to do. But starting a brawl in this bar doesn't prove them wrong. Proves them right. It makes us exactly what they think we are, emotional, undisciplined, and unable to control ourselves." Mitchell opened his mouth to argue, but Kowalski wasn't finished. "So here's what we're going to do, sir. We're going to sit here. We're going to be quiet. We're going to look these limey bastards in the eye and we're going to smile. And then we're going to make damn sure that General George S. Patton Jr. hears every single word they just said about American soldiers being inexperienced children playing dress-up. The farm boy from Ohio, still young, still eager, still learning what real warfare meant, slowly sat back down. The British officers, disappointed that their entertainment had been denied, turned back to their conversation. They laughed. They toasted to empire. They had no idea what they just set in motion. Kowalski nodded approvingly. Good, sir. Now finish your drink. We've got a meeting with General Patton in the morning. Mitchell stared at his glass, his hands still shaking. Kowalski, what's Patton going to do? The sergeant's smile was cold. It was the smile of a man who'd watched the trapdoor open beneath his enemies. Sir, I've heard stories about General Patton. He doesn't get angry. He gets even. And he does it with numbers. He leaned back, taking a long sip of his whiskey. You wanted to punch that colonel in the face? Patton's going to do something much worse to the entire British Army. The Americans finished their drinks in silence. The British officers laughed and carried on, oblivious. But something had changed in that club. The condescension, the mockery, the centuries of imperial superiority. It was about to crash headfirst into a man who had zero patience for European snobbery and exactly 1 million different ways to prove American superiority. And that man was just getting started. 24 hours later, Lieutenant Mitchell stood at attention in General Patton's headquarters. His spine rigid, his uniform immaculate, his voice steady as he recounted every word the British officers had said. The inexperienced little brother comment, sir. The children playing soldier crack. The dismissive attitude toward American military capability. They said we don't belong. They said we have the equipment but none of the experience. They said we show up late and act like we won the war single-handedly. Patton listened in complete silence. His face was absolutely unreadable. His famous ivory-handled revolvers hung at his hips. His fingers drummed on his desk in a rhythm that his staff had learned to recognize as the warning sign of an approaching storm. The only sound in the room was the steady tick-tick-tick of his fingernails against the polished wood. Mitchell finished his report and braced himself for the explosion. It never came. Instead, Patton did something that surprised everyone in the room. He leaned back in his chair. He folded his hands behind his head, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, not an angry smile. It was the smile of a poker player who just realized he's holding a royal flush and his opponents don't know it yet. It was the smile of a predator who just watched his prey walk willingly into a trap. Lieutenant, Patton said quietly, his voice calm and measured. You did the right thing bringing this to me instead of starting an international incident in a bar. Mitchell blinked. Sir, You were ready to fight them, weren't you? Patton interrupted, his eyes glinting with something between amusement and approval. You were ready to introduce that mustached colonel to your fist. Mitchell swallowed hard. Yes, sir, I was. Patton nodded slowly. I understand that instinct. I have it too, every single day. But here's what you need to understand, son. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. A fistfight in a bar ends with a bloody nose and a court-martial. What I'm about to do ends with the British Army never calling us inexperienced children again. And I'm going to make sure they're the ones who have to admit it. He turned to his chief of staff, Colonel Higgins, who'd been standing frozen in the corner, watching his commanding officer's mood shift from calm to absolutely lethal. Colonel, Patton said, his voice suddenly businesslike and sharp. Get me a meeting with General Montgomery and whoever else is available from British High Command. Tell them I want to discuss coordination of American and British forces for upcoming operations. Make it sound routine, boring even. I want them to be relaxed and comfortable. Higgins exchanged a glance with Mitchell. Both men knew that relaxed and comfortable British officers were about to have a very, very bad day. Patton continued, his fingers now tapping out an entirely new rhythm. And I want detailed reports on every military operation since D-Day. American versus British performance metrics, casualty ratios, ground taken, objectives achieved, everything. I want numbers and I want them ironclad. And I want them in my hands by tomorrow morning. Higgins nodded, already moving toward the door. Yes, sir. I'll have the intelligence section on it immediately. And Higgins, Patton called after him, make sure the data is verified. I want sources. I want timestamps. I want coordinates. When I present this information, I want it to be as undeniable as the sunrise. These British officers think they can hide behind their centuries of military tradition and their aristocratic officer corps. They think we're just a bunch of provincial colonials with expensive toys. I'm going to show them exactly how wrong they are with facts they cannot refute. Patton turned back to Mitchell, who was still standing at attention, unsure if he'd been dismissed. Lieutenant, you can stand at ease, Patton said, and you can relax. But I want you to know something. What you did in that bar, not fighting, not starting a brawl, but coming to me with this information, that was good soldiering. That was smart soldiering. And it's going to pay off in ways you can't even imagine. Mitchell finally allowed himself to breathe. Thank you, sir. But what exactly are you going to do? Patton's smile returned. It was even wider this time, and somehow even more terrifying. Son, I'm going to give the British military establishment the most educational experience of their entire existence. I'm going to show them data that proves American forces are outperforming them in virtually every category. I'm going to do it in front of their senior commanders. And I'm going to make Montgomery himself sit there and admit that the inexperienced little brother has been running this show from the beginning. He stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the French countryside. Now, you go get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow, you're going to watch a masterclass in how to destroy an enemy with facts, figures, and a burning desire to put arrogant Europeans in their place. Over the next 48 hours, Patton's headquarters transformed into a war room of a different kind. This wasn't about tanks or artillery. This was about numbers. Cold, hard, irrefutable numbers that would become the most devastating weapons in Patton's arsenal. Typewriters clacked in every corner. Officers ran between desks carrying stacks of reports. Intelligence analysts hunched over maps, cross-referencing casualty figures, ground gained, objectives achieved. The air smelled of coffee, sweat, and the kind of desperate energy that comes from working against an impossible deadline. Patton himself paced the room like a caged tiger, occasionally stopping to peer over an analyst's shoulder or bark a question at a harried staff officer. "Where are the casualty ratios?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a saber. "I asked for casualty ratios 4 hours ago." "Coming in now, sir," a young captain responded, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over a thick folder. "We've compiled data from every engagement since D-Day. American versus British. It's all there." Patton snatched the folder and flipped through it, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers with the speed of a man who'd been reading military reports since before most of these officers were born. His expression remained unreadable, but the drumming of his fingers on the desk told the whole story. He was pleased. "Good," he said, his voice quieter now. "This is exactly what I needed. Look at this." He pointed at a specific column. American forces have advanced an average of 12 miles per week since the landings. The British, 6, were moving twice as fast. A staff officer stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, I should note that some of the British operations faced particularly difficult terrain. The Bocage country in our sector." Patton cut him off with a wave of his hand. "I don't want excuses. I want facts. And the fact is, we're faster. We're taking more ground. And we're doing it with fewer casualties." He flipped to another page. "American casualties per mile advanced? Lower. Objective completion rate? Higher. We're securing objectives an average of 3 days ahead of schedule. The British are running 4 days behind. These aren't opinions. These are numbers." The room was silent except for the soft crinkle of papers and the distant rumble of artillery from the front lines. Patton continued pacing, his voice taking on the quality of a man building a case for a jury. I want more. I want logistics data, supply chain efficiency, vehicle maintenance turnaround times, medical evacuation response. Everything. If it involves American forces outperforming British forces, I want it in this presentation. Colonel Higgins, who'd been coordinating the effort, approached cautiously. Sir, are you sure this is the right approach? Montgomery won't take this well. He's got a reputation for. Patton turned, his eyes flashing dangerously. Colonel, I've been fighting this war long enough to know that sometimes you have to be willing to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Montgomery's reputation is exactly the problem. He's built his entire career on one victory at El Alamein, and he's been dining out on it ever since. Meanwhile, he's letting British officers insult American soldiers in public and treat us like we're the junior varsity team. He grabbed another folder, this one containing British operational reports. Look at this. Operation Goodwood. British forces through 3 armored divisions at German positions, gained 8 miles in 3 days at enormous cost, and then stopped. They call that resilience. I call it inadequate. We would never tolerate that kind of slow, methodical approach in the American military. A young intelligence officer spoke up. Sir, we've also compiled data on artillery effectiveness. American batteries are delivering fire support faster and more accurately than British equivalents. Our crews are using newer techniques, coordinated fire control, more aggressive deployment. Patton smiled. Perfect. Put that in the presentation. I want them to understand that our superiority isn't just about numbers and equipment. It's about innovation. It's about adapting faster. It's about being willing to do things differently instead of clinging to outdated traditions. He paused, looking around the room at his exhausted but determined staff. Gentlemen, I know this is a lot of work. I know you've been running on caffeine and adrenaline for 2 days straight, but what we're doing here matters. It's not just about winning a debate. It's about changing how the British military views us. It's about making sure that every American soldier in this theater gets the respect they deserve. He picked up the final folder, holding it up like a trophy. And I have the numbers to prove it. The meeting took place in a commandeered French chateau, its stone walls still scarred from the fighting that had swept through Normandy weeks earlier. Crystal chandeliers hung above tables covered in maps and documents. The juxtaposition of elegance and warfare was jarring, a reminder that this war was being fought in the heart of civilization itself. Montgomery arrived first, flanked by his senior commanders. He strode into the room with the confidence of a man who'd been winning battles, or at least claiming to, for years. His signature beret was perfectly angled. His demeanor was that of a headmaster about to address promising but unruly students. "Ah, General Patton," Montgomery said, extending a hand with practiced cordiality. "I must say, I was rather surprised by your request for a coordination meeting. Usually, it's our people asking to coordinate with you Americans on logistics and supply matters." Patton shook his hand, his grip firm but not crushing. His face was a mask of pleasant neutrality. "Field Marshal, I thought it would be useful to review the actual operational data so we can coordinate more effectively going forward. There seems to be some confusion about the relative capabilities and experience of American versus British forces." Montgomery's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The phrase relative capabilities clearly rankled him. "Of course, General Patton," Montgomery said, settling into his chair with the air of a man about to dispense wisdom. "We're always happy to share our experience with our American colleagues. After all, we've been at this considerably longer than you chaps." He gestured around the room at his assembled officers. "The British military tradition is one of the finest in the world. Centuries of experience, generations of leadership. I'm sure your officers will find our insights valuable." Patton nodded slowly, his face still pleasant, but his staff noticed the telltale drumming of his fingers on the table. The storm was gathering. "I appreciate that, Field Marshal," Patton said, "and I'm glad you mentioned experience, because I've been looking at the numbers from our operations since D-Day, and I'm seeing some patterns that might surprise you." He gestured to his staff, who unveiled large charts showing comparative data between American and British forces. The British officers sat up straighter, their casual confidence slowly giving way to curiosity, then concern. "Since the Normandy landings," Patton continued, his voice calm and measured, "American forces have advanced an average of 12 miles per week. British forces have advanced an average of 6 miles per week." He paused, letting the number sink in. "We're moving twice as fast." Montgomery's face started to color. His officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, a brigadier with a red face and thinning hair, shifted in his seat. But Patton wasn't done. Not even close. "American forces have captured 40% more territory with 20% fewer casualties. We've secured objectives an average of 3 days ahead of schedule, while British operations have run an average of 4 days behind schedule." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made his words more devastating. "Now, I'm just a simple American who apparently doesn't understand the sophisticated European military tradition. But those numbers suggest that maybe, just maybe, we inexperienced children are doing something right." The room went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Montgomery looked like he'd been slapped across the face with a white glove. His officers were turning various shades of red and purple, their aristocratic composure crumbling by the second. One of the British brigadiers, the red-faced man, tried to mount a defense. "Those statistics don't account for the quality of opposition. British forces have consistently faced stronger German positions." Patton turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "That's complete and total." He stopped himself, the pause hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. "That's simply not true, Brigadier. We've analyzed the German unit dispositions. You're not facing tougher opposition. You're just slower to overcome it." The British officers looked like they wanted to argue but couldn't find the words, and Patton was just getting warmed up. Patton rose from his chair and walked to the chart board, his boots clicking against the marble floor with deliberate precision. He didn't look at Montgomery. He looked at the charts, at the numbers he'd memorized, at the evidence he was about to unleash. "But let's talk about experience," he continued, his voice taking on an edge that could cut through steel. "You're right that Britain has been in this war longer than America. You've been fighting since 1939, and in those 5 years you've been driven out of Norway, driven out of France, driven out of Greece, and nearly driven out of North Africa." He turned to face Montgomery directly. "You lost Singapore, you lost Hong Kong, you lost Burma. You've spent most of this war retreating, holding defensive lines, waiting for someone to come save you." The room went absolutely silent. Montgomery looked like he'd been struck. His face, which had been red with indignation, now drained to a pale, sickly white. His officers sat frozen, their mouths slightly open, unable to process what they were hearing. Patton continued, his voice rising slightly. "America entered this war in December 1941. In 2.5 years, we've completely destroyed Japanese naval power in the Pacific. We've liberated North Africa. We've conquered Sicily. We've invaded Italy. And we've established the largest beachhead in military history on the French coast." He walked back to stand directly in front of Montgomery, his eyes boring into the British commander like drill bits. "We've done more in 30 months than you accomplished in the previous 60. So tell me, Field Marshal, who exactly is the inexperienced little brother here?" Montgomery sputtered, trying to find his voice. "General Patton, Britain stood alone against Hitler. We fought the Battle of Britain. We held the line when no one else would fight. The Commonwealth sacrifices." "Yes, Britain stood alone," Patton interrupted, his voice sharp as a cavalry saber. "And Britain got its ass kicked alone, until America showed up with the money, equipment, and military power to actually win this war." He walked over to another chart, this one showing logistics data. "Lend-Lease didn't just supply your military. It saved your country from economic collapse and starvation. American industrial capacity is producing more war material in a month than British factories produce in a year. And American generals who you dismiss as inexperienced are running circles around British commanders who are still fighting World War I with slightly better tanks. One of the British brigadiers, the red-faced one, found his voice. "This is outrageous. General Patton, you can't just—" "I can," Patton said flatly. "And I am. Because someone needs to tell you the truth, and apparently none of your own officers have the courage to do it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But somehow it was more menacing than if he'd been shouting. "You want to talk about military tradition? Fine. Britain's military tradition is empire building against technologically inferior opponents, followed by losing to any peer competitor who actually fights back. America's military tradition is innovation, adaptation, and winning. We don't have centuries of aristocratic officer corps tradition holding us back. We promote based on competence, not birth. We innovate because we're not constrained by doing things the proper way. And we win because we focus on results instead of style points." Montgomery finally found his voice, trying to salvage some dignity. "General Patton, I think you're being rather ungracious about Britain's contributions to this war. We held the line when no one else would." "You held the line because you had no other choice," Patton interrupted. "Don't mistake necessity for virtue." He walked to yet another presentation board, this one showing troop performance metrics. "Let's talk about the quality of troops. Since D-Day, American infantry units have had a 73% success rate in achieving initial objectives in combat operations. British infantry has achieved a 54% success rate. American armor has destroyed German tanks at a ratio of 1.8 to 1. British armor is barely managing 1.1 to 1. American forces have adapted to hedgerow fighting, urban combat, and combined arms operations faster than any military in history. Meanwhile, British forces are still using tactics that would have been outdated in 1918. He turned back to Montgomery, his eyes blazing. "So tell me again, Field Marshal, who exactly is the inexperienced little brother here?" The chateau's grand hall had become a pressure cooker. The British officers sat rigid in their chairs, their faces masks of barely contained fury and humiliation. Montgomery's hands were clenched so tightly on the table that his knuckles had gone white. His signature beret, usually perched at a jaunty angle, now sat slightly askew, as if even it was unsettled by what was happening. But Patton wasn't finished. He walked slowly around the table, his boots echoing in the suffocating silence. He stopped directly behind Montgomery's chair and placed his hands on the back of it, leaning down so his voice would carry directly over the Field Marshal's shoulder. "Let's talk about your reputation, Field Marshal, because you've built your entire career on exactly one significant victory. El Alamein." Montgomery stiffened, his jaw tightened. "And you know what El Alamein really demonstrates?" Patton continued, his voice dripping with calculated disdain. "When you have overwhelming numerical superiority, complete air dominance, perfect intelligence about enemy positions and supply situations, and months to prepare, British forces can defeat a German army that's already starving and out of fuel." He straightened up and walked back to the front of the room, facing the entire British delegation. "Congratulations. That's not military genius. That's basic competence with every possible advantage." The room erupted. One of the British brigadiers shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "General Patton, you go too far. Field Marshal Montgomery is one of the most respected commanders in the British Army. His victory at El Alamein turned the tide in North Africa. Without it, you would have lost North Africa entirely." Patton cut him off, his voice flat and cold. "Which is exactly what was happening before El Alamein. The British 8th Army was retreating. Rommel was pushing deeper into Egypt. And then, finally, after months of retreat and reorganization, the British won a single battle. A battle they should have won months earlier. A battle that only happened because America supplied you with the equipment, the fuel, and the air power to finally stop running. Montgomery finally spoke, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "General Patton, I will not sit here and allow you to." "You will sit here and listen," Patton said, his voice rising to match Montgomery's. "Because this isn't about your ego. This is about the fact that British officers in this theater are calling American soldiers inexperienced children behind their backs. They're treating us like we're the junior varsity team in a war we're actually winning. And I'm going to make sure that stops." He walked back to stand directly in front of Montgomery, close enough that the British commander could see the cold fury in his eyes. "You want to talk about military tradition? Let's talk about your military tradition. The British Army has been fighting for centuries. And in those centuries, you've built an empire by defeating technologically inferior opponents. But whenever you've faced a peer competitor, someone with equal equipment and equal training, what happened?" He let the question hang in the air. "The American Revolution. You lost. The War of 1812. You lost. The Boer War. You nearly lost. World War I. You only won because America showed up at the end. And now World War II. We're fighting side by side. And you're acting like you're still the senior partner when the numbers prove you're not even keeping up." Montgomery tried to interrupt, but Patton held up a hand. "I'm not finished. You've been fighting since 1939, and you've lost more ground than you've gained. You've been pushed out of Norway, France, Greece, and North Africa. You lost Singapore, Hong Kong, and Burma. Your empire is collapsing, and you're still acting like the world revolves around London. But it doesn't anymore. The center of Allied power isn't London. It's Washington. The decisive military force isn't the British Army. It's the American military." Patton stepped back, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its edge. "And if that truth hurts, gentlemen, then maybe it's time you stopped dining out on past glories and started accepting reality. Because the sooner you accept it, the sooner we can actually work together as equals instead of pretending you're still running this show." The silence in the chateau was absolute. Montgomery sat frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly on the table. His officers looked like men who'd just survived an artillery barrage. Shell-shocked, disoriented, uncertain whether the worst was over or just beginning. Patton walked slowly back to his seat, but he didn't sit down. He stood behind his chair, his hands resting on its back, his posture shifting from aggressive to something approaching conversational. "Look, gentlemen," he said, his voice softer now, losing the razor's edge but still carrying undeniable authority. "I didn't call this meeting to humiliate you." A British brigadier snorted involuntarily, then quickly suppressed it. "Well, maybe a little bit to humiliate you," Patton amended, a hint of dark humor creeping into his voice. "But that wasn't the main purpose. I called this meeting because I heard that some British officers, maybe some of you in this room, maybe not, have been calling American soldiers inexperienced children and referring to us as Britain's little brother playing at war." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And I needed to make something absolutely clear. Those days are over. America isn't Britain's little brother. We're not your former colony still seeking approval. We're not inexperienced children who need guidance from sophisticated Europeans. We are the most powerful military force on this planet, and we're proving it every single day on battlefields from Normandy to the Pacific." He walked around the table slowly, making eye contact with each British officer in turn. "The British Empire is dying. You know it. I know it. Everyone paying attention knows it. After this war, Britain will be a secondary power managing decline. America will be the dominant superpower shaping the new world order. That's not arrogance. That's demographic reality, economic fact, and military truth." Montgomery opened his mouth to protest, but Patton held up a hand. "You can resent it. You can mock us behind our backs in your officers' clubs. Or you can accept it and work with us as genuine partners instead of pretending you're still the senior partner in this alliance." He walked back to his chair and sat down, his posture relaxing slightly. His eyes, however, remained sharp as daggers. "Here's what's going to happen going forward. American and British forces will coordinate as equals. Genuine equals. Not the patronizing where you treat us like promising students who might someday match British standards. When American commanders make tactical decisions, British officers will respect those decisions instead of second-guessing them based on the assumption that we don't know what we're doing. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And if I hear one more word about Americans being inexperienced children or Britain's little brother, I will personally ensure that every instance of British military underperformance is documented, publicized, and used to justify giving American commanders operational priority in every theater. Montgomery, defeated but trying to maintain some dignity, nodded slowly. His face was still pale, but his composure was returning. General Patton, your points are noted. Perhaps there has been some unwarranted condescension in some quarters. I will ensure that British officers are reminded of the importance of Allied cooperation. Not cooperation, Patton corrected, his voice firm but not hostile. Partnership. Real partnership between equals. Because here's the truth, Field Marshal. America doesn't need Britain to win this war. We're perfectly capable of beating Germany and Japan without you. But winning together is faster and costs fewer lives on both sides. So let's drop the Imperial Superiority Act and work together as partners who respect each other's capabilities. Can you do that? The British officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Montgomery took a long breath, then nodded with as much grace as he could muster. Yes, General Patton, we can do that. Patton stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Excellent. Then let's get back to work. We've got a war to win. And I don't give a damn whether it's won the British way or the American way. As long as it's won the fastest way with the fewest casualties. Dismissed. As the British officers filed out of the conference room, several of them looking like they just survived a firing squad, one of Patton's own staff officers approached him quietly. Sir, that was intense. Do you think you might have been too harsh? We still need to work with these guys. Patton smiled, and this time it was almost friendly. Colonel, those British officers needed a wake-up call. They've been dining out on past glories and imperial mythology for so long, they forgot that the world has changed. Now they know where they stand. And you know what? They'll be better allies for it. Because they'll stop condescending to us and start actually listening when we talk. But Patton wasn't finished. A meeting was one thing. Words, even devastating ones, could be dismissed as rhetoric. Statistics, however undeniable, could be forgotten. What Patton needed was something the British couldn't ignore, couldn't explain away, and couldn't forget. He needed a demonstration. 2 weeks after the conference room confrontation, Patton orchestrated what his staff called Operation Humble Pie. Officially, it was framed as cooperative training exercises designed to improve coordination between American and British forces. Unofficially, it was Patton creating opportunities to embarrass British units and prove American superiority in ways that couldn't be dismissed as statistical manipulation. The first exercise was a timed advance through simulated enemy territory. American and British armored units would tackle the same course with the same obstacles. Patton made sure observers from both militaries were present, along with a few carefully selected war correspondents. The American unit was a tank battalion from the 4th Armored Division. They were aggressive, innovative, and trained to adapt on the fly. They'd been fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy for weeks and had developed tactics that would later become legendary. The British unit was a comparable armored battalion that Montgomery personally selected. He wanted to put his best foot forward. He wanted to prove that the statistics Patton had presented were anomalies, not the norm. The course was brutal. Simulated enemy positions, obstacles designed to slow armor, unexpected terrain challenges. It was designed to test everything a mechanized unit might face in combat. The American unit completed the course in 2 hours and 17 minutes. They adapted quickly to unexpected obstacles. They coordinated effectively between tanks and supporting infantry. They achieved all objectives with minimal simulated casualties. The British unit took 4 hours and 43 minutes. They got bogged down at several points. They required extensive reorganization. They suffered significantly higher simulated losses. Their commanders, trained in the methodical British approach, simply couldn't match the speed and improvisation of their American counterparts. The American observers were professionally respectful. The British officers looked like they wanted to disappear into the ground. The second exercise was even more devastating to British pride. Patton organized a live-fire artillery competition. American artillery batteries competed against British equivalents in terms of accuracy, speed of deployment, and sustained fire capability. The American artillery units used newer techniques, coordinated fire control, aggressive deployment strategies. They could set up faster, adjust fire more quickly, deliver more accurate strikes, and sustain higher rates of fire. The British artillery used more traditional methods: careful preparation, methodical execution. They emphasized precision over speed, planning over improvisation. They simply couldn't match the speed and intensity of American fire support. One British artillery officer, watching American crews in action, was overheard saying to a colleague, "Good God, they fire artillery like they're playing jazz music. All improvisation and energy. We're still conducting it like a classical symphony, and we're getting absolutely shown up." The exercises continued for a week. Every competition told the same story. American forces were faster, more innovative, and more effective. The British, steeped in centuries of military tradition, simply couldn't adapt as quickly. After the week of exercises, Patton called another meeting with British command. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. The British officers arrived without their earlier arrogance. Montgomery himself was considerably more subdued. "Gentlemen," Patton began, his tone firm but not antagonistic, "I hope the past week has been educational. I didn't organize these exercises to humiliate you. Well, maybe a little bit to humiliate you, but mainly to demonstrate that American military capability is real, quantifiable, and frankly superior to British performance in most areas that matter for winning this war. Can we now agree that the inexperienced little brother narrative is complete horseshit?" Montgomery, to his credit, nodded with something approaching genuine humility. "General Patton, your point is made. American forces have demonstrated exceptional capability. Any British officers who continue to underestimate American military prowess are living in denial. I will personally ensure that such attitudes are corrected within British ranks." Patton nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Field Marshal. Now let's get to work. We've still got a war to win, and we're going to win it together. But this time, we're doing it as equals." The effect of Operation Humble Pie spread through Allied headquarters like wildfire. Within days, every American unit in the theater had heard the story. American soldiers, who'd been enduring British condescension for months, walked a little taller. They fought with renewed intensity, knowing that their leadership had their backs. The morale boost was immediate and undeniable. British officers, meanwhile, found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The jokes about inexperienced Americans had stopped, partly because they were no longer funny, partly because they'd learned that American officers had very long memories and very detailed statistics ready to deploy in response. The change in attitude was measurable. British officers started treating their American counterparts with genuine respect instead of patronizing tolerance. Coordination between units improved. The alliance, strained by years of imperial arrogance, began to function more smoothly. But not everyone was happy. 3 days after the final exercise, Patton received an unexpected summons. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man responsible for holding the fragile Allied coalition together, wanted to see him. The message was polite but firm. Eisenhower's tone, even on paper, suggested that this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Patton arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters with his characteristic swagger, but even he knew he was in for a conversation. Eisenhower was waiting for him, his famous calm demeanor masking what Patton suspected was barely controlled frustration. "George," Eisenhower said, gesturing for Patton to sit. I've had 3 separate complaints from British Command about your confrontational approach to alliance management. Montgomery says you were unnecessarily harsh. He says you humiliated his officers in front of their subordinates and undermined British military confidence. Patton didn't hesitate. Ike, those British officers were calling American soldiers inexperienced children and treating us like we're guests in their war instead of the main force actually winning it. I provided statistical evidence that American forces outperform British forces in virtually every meaningful metric. I organized competitive exercises that proved the same point. And I secured an agreement for genuine cooperation as equals instead of the patronizing treatment we were getting before. If that's confrontational, then I'm guilty as charged, and I'd do it again tomorrow. Eisenhower sighed. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, a slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You know, I can't officially approve of what you did. I have to maintain diplomatic relations with our British allies. Publicly humiliating their officers doesn't make that easier. I know, Patton acknowledged. That's why you have me do the dirty work while you stay above the fray. You're the good cop who maintains alliance harmony. I'm the bad cop who makes sure nobody mistakes American politeness for American weakness. We're a team, Ike. You keep the alliance together. I make sure we're respected within it. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair, studying Patton for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rumble of artillery from the front lines. Off the record, George, you were right to do it. Those British officers needed to understand that the world has changed and America is leading now, not following. They've been dining out on imperial glory for too long, and they needed a reality check. Patton nodded, a rare moment of humility crossing his face. Thank you, Ike. But, Eisenhower continued, his voice firming, next time, maybe give me a heads up before you systematically demolish British military pride with PowerPoint presentations and live-fire exercises. Patton grinned. Where's the fun in that? Eisenhower shook his head, but the smile remained. Just get out of here, George, and try not to start another international incident before lunch. Sir, no promises, Patton said, saluting as he turned to leave. As he walked out of Eisenhower's office, Patton's staff officer, Colonel Higgins, fell into step beside him. Sir, that went better than I expected. General Eisenhower seemed almost amused. Patton's grin widened. Higgins, Ike knows what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. He may have to officially reprimand me for the record, but off the record, he's probably the happiest man in this theater. Because now the British are actually listening to us instead of treating us like colonial apprentices. But sir, Higgins pressed, what if they complain to London? What if this reaches Churchill? Patton laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Let them complain. Let Churchill know. Do you think Churchill doesn't know exactly what's happening? He's a realist. He knows the British Empire is dying. He just doesn't want to admit it publicly. And now I've given him the perfect excuse to blame American arrogance instead of British decline. He clapped Higgins on the shoulder. Colonel, we're winning this war, and more importantly, we're winning the peace that comes after it. The British may have centuries of military tradition, but we have something better. We have the future. The story of Patton's confrontation didn't end in that chateau. It didn't end with the exercises or Eisenhower's half-approving reprimand. The true payoff came years later, when the war was over and the history books were being written. Because history, unlike propaganda, has a way of revealing the truth. Within months of Patton's brutal takedown, the effects were visible across the European theater. British officers stopped making jokes about inexperienced Americans. The condescending attitudes that had poisoned early interactions largely disappeared, replaced by genuine professional respect. And American soldiers, knowing that Patton had stood up for them, fought with even greater intensity and pride. The alliance functioned better than ever before. Coordination improved. Communication opened up. The two militaries, once divided by centuries of tradition and mutual suspicion, began to work together as genuine partners. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Years after the war, one of the British officers who had been present at that initial confrontation wrote about the experience in his memoirs. His name was Colonel Sir Reginald Whitfield, a decorated officer who had served with distinction throughout the war. He had been one of the brigadiers in that conference room, one of the men Patton had systematically demolished with facts and figures. His memoirs, published in the 1960s, contained a passage that would become legendary in military circles. "General Patton taught us a humbling but necessary lesson," Whitfield wrote. "We British had grown so accustomed to being the dominant military power, so comfortable with our imperial traditions and our sense of cultural superiority, that we failed to recognize when the torch had been passed." He continued, "America had surpassed us, not just in industrial capacity or manpower, but in military innovation, operational tempo, and combat effectiveness. Our officers had been calling them inexperienced children, but the reality was that they had become the most powerful military force on the planet while we were still dining out on the glories of Trafalgar and Waterloo." Whitfield's words were devastating in their honesty. He admitted that Patton's statistical evidence had been irrefutable. He acknowledged that American forces had outperformed British forces in virtually every measurable category. And he concluded with a statement that would haunt British military pride for generations. Patton's brutal honesty, backed by irrefutable evidence, forced us to confront a reality we had been avoiding. The 20th century belonged to America, not Britain. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it made us better allies and probably better soldiers. The memoir caused a sensation when it was published. British newspapers ran headlines about the American admission. Conservative politicians denounced Whitfield as a traitor to British pride. But older officers, the ones who had actually served alongside Americans, quietly admitted that he was telling the truth. Other British officers followed suit. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to acknowledge what Patton had proven in that conference room. The American military had become the dominant force in the Western Alliance. The British Empire was in decline, and the inexperienced little brother was now running the show. Patton himself never publicly commented on Whitfield's memoirs, but those who knew him said he kept a copy on his nightstand until the day he died. He didn't need to gloat. The validation spoke for itself. Eisenhower, when asked about the memoirs years later, simply smiled and said, "George always said that facts don't lie. I guess he was right." The story of Patton's confrontation became a legend, passed down through generations of American soldiers. It was taught at West Point. It was referenced in military history books. It became a symbol of American military excellence and the refusal to accept being treated as second best. And for the British, it became a cautionary tale. A reminder that military tradition and imperial glory mean nothing if you can't back them up with performance on the battlefield. The inexperienced little brother had become the big brother, and the British, despite their centuries of military tradition, had learned the hard way that America wasn't asking for permission to lead. They were simply taking the lead, and nothing the British could say or do would change that reality. 60 years later, British military historians still debate what happened in that chateau. But one thing is certain: when British officers called Americans inexperienced little brothers, George S. Patton Jr. didn't just defend American honor. He proved, with irrefutable evidence, that America had become the dominant military power on Earth. That's what American excellence looks like. Not bragging without substance, backing every claim with hard facts and undeniable performance. We don't win through tradition or aristocratic officer corps. We win through innovation, aggression, and refusing to accept being treated as second best. If the story fired you up, show us some love. Smash that like button. Subscribe right now because we've got dozens more stories about Americans proving doubters wrong. And drop a comment. Patton with his aggressive confrontation or Eisenhower with his diplomatic style? Which approach do you respect more? Share this with any veteran, any Brit who needs a history lesson, or any American who's ever been underestimated. Because the American way isn't asking for respect. It's earning it.